The moment my boss called me replaceable, the room went quiet in that uncomfortable way people do when they know something humiliating is happening but don't want to get involved. We were sitting around the conference table during our Monday leadership meeting when he looked directly at me and said, "Let's be honest, if Emily left tomorrow, we'd have someone in her seat by next week." A few people laughed. A few avoided eye contact. One person actually nodded. I felt every pair of eyes drift toward me, waiting for a reaction, an argument, maybe even tears. Instead, I smiled politely, opened my notebook, and wrote down a single name. That's all I did. My boss noticed it. "Taking notes?" he asked with a smirk. "Something like that," I replied. The meeting moved on, but I could feel the curiosity spreading across the room. Nobody knew why I wrote that name. Nobody knew I'd heard something 2 days earlier that completely changed how I saw the company. Nobody knew that one person outside that conference room held more influence over our future than anyone sitting at that table. So while everyone else enjoyed watching me get humiliated, I quietly started counting the days. Because for the first time in my career, I wasn't worried about what my boss thought of me. I was wondering how long it would take for him to realize what he'd just done. My name is Emily Carter, and at 28 years old, I had spent nearly 4 years building a reputation for solving problems nobody else wanted. I wasn't the loudest person in the office, and I definitely wasn't the type to fight for attention. While other managers competed for visibility, I focused on results. If a client was angry, I handled it. If a project was falling apart, I fixed it. If a deadline looked impossible, I found a way to make it happen. Most people appreciated that quietly. My boss, Richard, seemed to resent it. The more successful our department became, the more determined he appeared to position himself as the reason. Over time, my contributions became his talking points. My solutions became his leadership wins. I noticed it, but I never challenged him publicly because experience had taught me something important. People reveal themselves when they believe they're untouchable. The promotion announcement scheduled for the end of the quarter made everything worse. Richard had already made it obvious who his favorite candidate was, and it wasn't me. Around the office, people whispered that my career had stalled, that I worked too hard without playing politics well enough. They weren't entirely wrong. What nobody knew was that 48 hours before that meeting, I received information that made office politics feel completely irrelevant. And it all started with a phone call I wasn't supposed to hear. The phone call happened late Friday evening when most of the office had already left for the weekend. I was finishing revisions on a client proposal that Richard had promised would be ready by Monday morning, despite the fact that he hadn't contributed a single page to it. The building was unusually quiet, and I had moved into one of the smaller conference rooms to focus. As I walked back toward my desk to grab a file, I heard voices coming from Richard's office. His door was partially open. Normally, I wouldn't have paid attention, but I recognized the voice on speakerphone immediately. It belonged to Daniel Harper, the founder of the company and the man who still owned a controlling share despite stepping away from daily operations years earlier. Daniel rarely contacted department managers directly, which made the conversation unusual. Richard's tone was dramatically different from the confident, self-important version everyone saw during meetings. He sounded nervous. Very nervous. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but a sentence stopped me in my tracks. Daniel asked a simple question. "Who is actually handling the Lawson account these days?" There was a pause. Richard answered, "My team manages it." Another pause followed. "That's not what I asked," Daniel replied. "Who handles it?" Richard eventually said my name. Then Daniel asked who had managed the recovery after the client's contract nearly collapsed the previous year. Richard said my name again. "Who rebuilt the relationship?" My name. "Who designed the retention strategy?" My name. "Who was coordinating the upcoming expansion proposal?" Once again, my name. By then, I was standing completely still. Richard sounded increasingly uncomfortable. Daniel finally said something that stayed with me all weekend. "Interesting." Every time I ask about a problem that got solved, the answer seems to be Emily. The call ended shortly afterward. Richard emerged from his office looking frustrated enough to punch a wall. He never noticed me walking away. I spent the entire drive home replaying that conversation. Not because it felt like a victory, but because it confirmed something I had suspected for a long time. People at the very top were starting to ask questions. Questions Richard couldn't easily control. Monday's leadership meeting only reinforced that feeling. After Richard called me replaceable and several coworkers laughed, I wrote down Daniel Harper's name in my notebook. Not because I expected him to rescue me. Not because I planned to contact him. I wrote it down because I wanted to remember exactly who had asked the questions Richard couldn't answer comfortably. The following weeks became strangely tense around the office. Richard intensified his efforts to promote his favorite employee, Kyle, as the department's future leader. Kyle wasn't incompetent, but he had become accustomed to receiving opportunities without earning them. Richard placed him in charge of high-visibility presentations, invited him to executive lunches, and openly discussed his leadership potential in front of the rest of us. Meanwhile, I found myself excluded from meetings I had previously led. Important updates stopped reaching me. Decisions affecting my projects were made without my input. The message was obvious. Richard was creating a narrative. Kyle was the future. I was replaceable. What made the situation almost surreal was that the workload never changed. Whenever a client crisis appeared, my phone still rang first. Whenever a project started slipping behind schedule, someone quietly asked for my help. Publicly, I was becoming less important. Privately, the department still depended on me every single day. I kept detailed notes. Not because I was planning revenge, but because I had learned that facts become valuable when stories start changing. Then, 3 weeks after the meeting, Richard announced that Kyle would lead the company's most important client presentation of the year. The client was Lawson Industries. And the moment I heard that decision, I realized Richard had finally made a mistake he couldn't easily fix. The room erupted in applause when Richard announced that Kyle would lead the Lawson Industries presentation. It was the kind of assignment people talked about for months afterward because Lawson wasn't just another client. They represented nearly a quarter of our department's annual revenue and had been with the company for over a decade. Losing them would create panic at every level of the organization. Richard stood at the front of the room smiling proudly while Kyle accepted congratulations from coworkers who were already treating him like the promotion had been officially announced. I clapped politely along with everyone else. Nobody seemed surprised except me. Not because Kyle got the opportunity, but because Richard had chosen the one client relationship that couldn't be managed through appearances. Lawson was different. Their executives didn't care about titles, office politics, or carefully crafted leadership narratives. They cared about results. More importantly, they remembered exactly who had delivered those results. For nearly 3 years, I had been their primary point of contact during every major challenge. I knew their concerns, their priorities, their internal struggles, and the personalities behind every decision. Richard knew that. Which made his decision even stranger. Over the next 2 weeks, preparations intensified. Kyle scheduled strategy sessions, assigned responsibilities, and confidently spoke about the presentation as if he had personally built the relationship from the beginning. I noticed something else as well. Every major recommendation he planned to present came directly from systems and strategies I had developed over the previous 18 months. Sometimes entire sections appeared almost word for word from documents I originally created. I never mentioned it. Every time someone expected me to object, I remained calm. The silence seemed to confuse people more than resistance would have. One afternoon, my coworker Rachel closed my office door after a project meeting. "Why aren't you fighting this?" she asked. "Fighting what?" I replied. "Emily, everybody sees what's happening." She lowered her voice. "Richard is building Kyle's promotion using your work." I smiled. "Then let's hope the work is good." Rachel stared at me for several seconds before shaking her head. You're way too calm. The truth was that I wasn't calm because I felt powerless. I was calm because something didn't make sense. Lawson executives were unusually involved in presentation planning that year. They requested additional meetings. They asked detailed questions. They wanted revisions to schedules that had already been approved. Their behavior suggested they were paying closer attention than normal. Then, for days before the presentation, I received an unexpected phone call. The caller ID displayed a Lawson Industries number. When I answered, I immediately recognized the voice of Sandra Mitchell, their Chief Operations Officer. We had worked together through multiple crises over the years. After a few minutes discussing project details, she paused. "Quick question," she said. "Will you be attending next week's presentation?" The question sounded casual, but something about her tone felt deliberate. "I'm not scheduled to present," I answered. Another pause followed. "I see." Then she changed the subject completely. The conversation ended a few minutes later. That should have been the end of it. Instead, Sandra called again the following day. This time she asked several highly specific questions about recommendations Kyle planned to present. Recommendations that supposedly originated from his team. As I listened, a realization slowly formed. Sandra already knew where those ideas came from. She wasn't gathering information. She was confirming it. After we ended the call, I opened my notebook and added another entry beneath Daniel Harper's name. 2 days later, the presentation finally arrived. Executives from both companies filled the conference center. Richard looked confident. Kyle looked excited. Everyone seemed convinced they were walking into a career-defining success. I took a seat near the back of the room and quietly reviewed my notes while people settled into place. Then Sandra Mitchell entered alongside several senior Lawson executives. She glanced across the room, spotted me immediately, and smiled. It wasn't a friendly greeting. It looked more like recognition. For the first time all morning, I noticed Richard's confidence falter. He saw it too. And as the presentation began, I had the distinct feeling that someone was about to ask a question nobody on stage was prepared to answer. Kyle opened the presentation with the confidence of someone who believed the outcome had already been decided. The slides were polished, the numbers looked impressive, and Richard sat nearby wearing the satisfied expression of a manager watching his chosen successor perform exactly as expected. Around the room, executives nodded politely while taking notes. For the first 20 minutes, everything appeared to be going according to plan. Then Sandra Mitchell raised her hand. The room immediately grew quieter. Unlike most client representatives, Sandra rarely interrupted presentations. When she spoke, people listened. Kyle smiled and invited her question. Sandra looked down at her notes before speaking. "You mentioned the recovery framework that stabilized our logistics division 18 months ago. Can you explain how that strategy evolved from the original implementation?" Kyle froze for a fraction of a second. Most people probably didn't notice. I did. The problem wasn't the question itself. The problem was that the recovery framework had never been his project. He attempted an answer anyway, speaking in broad corporate language that sounded impressive without actually explaining anything. Sandra listened politely. Then she asked a follow-up question. This one was more detailed. Kyle stumbled again. Richard shifted slightly in his chair. Sandra asked another question. Then another. Each one focused on specific decisions, conversations, and strategic adjustments that had occurred over the years. The atmosphere in the room changed almost imperceptibly. Executives stopped checking their phones. Side conversations disappeared. People began paying attention. Kyle's confidence slowly unraveled as he struggled to explain initiatives he had never personally managed. Finally, Sandra closed her notebook and asked a question so direct that even the people in the back of the room straightened in their seats. Who actually developed these programs? The silence that followed felt endless. Kyle glanced toward Richard. Richard answered before Kyle could. This was a collaborative team effort. Sandra nodded slowly. That's interesting. She turned toward the group of Lawson executives seated beside her. Because every progress meeting, every emergency call, every restructuring discussion, and every implementation review we attended over the last 3 years involved the same person. Nobody spoke. Sandra looked directly toward the back of the room. Toward me. Emily, would you join us up front? I could feel hundreds of eyes turning in my direction as I stood and walked forward. The room had become so quiet that the sound of my footsteps echoed against the walls. Richard's expression had completely changed. For the first time since I'd known him, he looked uncertain. Sandra handed me a microphone. Let's try this again, she said. Can you explain how the recovery framework evolved? The answer took less than 2 minutes because I had actually built it. Sandra followed with additional questions. Then another executive asked about contract retention. Another asked about expansion planning. Another asked about operational restructuring. Each question connected directly to work I had led. Within minutes, the entire dynamic of the presentation shifted. Instead of watching Kyle explain my strategies, the room was listening to the person who had created them. The most revealing moment arrived near the end of the meeting. One Lawson executive opened a folder and reviewed several project summaries. I have a question, he said. Why wasn't Emily listed as presentation lead? Nobody answered immediately. Richard attempted a response about organizational structure and leadership development, but even he seemed aware that it sounded weak. Sandra interrupted him before he finished. Respectfully, she said, if we're discussing the future of this partnership, we'd prefer to speak with the person actually responsible for its success. The sentence landed like a hammer. Several executives exchanged uncomfortable looks. Richard stared at the table. Kyle looked like he wanted to disappear entirely. The meeting ended shortly afterward, but the damage had already been done. What nobody in the room realized was that the presentation itself wasn't the real problem. The real problem was that several senior executives from my company had witnessed everything firsthand. And among them sat a man who hadn't attended a client meeting in years. A man who had spent the entire presentation taking notes without saying a word. Daniel Harper. The atmosphere inside the building changed before we even returned from the conference center. By the time I reached my office the following morning, people were already discussing the presentation in hushed conversations near coffee stations and conference rooms. Some employees avoided eye contact with Richard altogether. Others suddenly seemed eager to speak with me. The shift wasn't dramatic, but it was noticeable. For months, maybe years, a carefully managed story had existed inside the company. Richard was the visionary leader. Kyle was the rising star. I was the reliable employee who worked quietly in the background. That story had survived because most people never had access to enough information to question it. Now they did. Around noon, an email arrived from the executive office requesting my attendance at a leadership review meeting scheduled for the following day. Richard and Kyle received invitations as well. Nobody said much about it publicly, but everyone knew the timing wasn't a coincidence. The meeting took place in one of the larger executive conference rooms. When I entered, Daniel Harper was already seated at the head of the table. Although he rarely involved himself in daily operations, his presence alone was enough to make senior leaders nervous. Richard looked exhausted. Kyle appeared uncomfortable. Several executives from finance, operations, and human resources sat quietly reviewing documents. Daniel waited until everyone settled before speaking. I'd like to understand how responsibilities have been assigned within this department, he said. The question sounded simple. It wasn't. For nearly 2 hours, executives reviewed project histories, client records, performance evaluations, revenue reports, and leadership recommendations. The deeper they looked, the harder it became to reconcile official narratives with actual results. Time after time, major achievements linked back to work I had led, solved, or rescued. Yet the visibility, recognition, and advancement opportunities had consistently flowed elsewhere. Human resources presented internal feedback reports. Operations shared client satisfaction data. Finance reviewed account retention numbers. Each document told the same story from a different angle. Nobody accused Richard of anything illegal or unethical. The facts alone created the problem. Daniel listened patiently throughout the entire process. Then he asked the question that seemed to matter most. If Emily is replaceable, he said calmly, why does every critical success lead back to her? Nobody answered immediately. Richard eventually attempted an explanation involving teamwork and departmental collaboration. Daniel simply nodded and looked down at his notes. The conversation moved on, but the room already knew what had happened. The meeting ended without dramatic speeches, arguments, or public confrontations. Daniel thanked everyone for their time and left. That was it. 2 days later, Richard announced that he would be leaving the company to pursue other opportunities. Officially, it was a voluntary decision. Unofficially, nobody believed that for a second. Kyle remained with the organization, though his fast track to leadership disappeared almost overnight. To his credit, he eventually approached me privately. I should have paid more attention to where the work was actually coming from, he admitted. It wasn't an apology exactly, but it was honest. A month later, I received an offer to lead a newly expanded client strategy division. The promotion came with a significant salary increase, a larger team, and direct access to executive leadership. When the announcement became public, dozens of coworkers congratulated me. Some seemed genuinely happy. Others looked embarrassed by how quickly they'd accepted the old narrative. The strangest moment happened a few weeks after I moved into my new office. While organizing notebooks from the previous year, I found the page from that Monday meeting. The one where Richard had called me replaceable. In the center of the page sat a single name written in blue ink. Daniel Harper. I stared at it for a moment and smiled. People often imagine karma as something loud and dramatic. In my experience, it usually arrives much more quietly. It starts when the right people begin asking the right questions. And once those questions are asked, the truth has a way of introducing itself. Sometimes all you have to do is stay calm long enough to let it happen. A year later, the company looked very different. The client strategy division had become one of the fastest growing parts of the business, and several of the systems my team developed were being adopted company-wide. Lawson Industries expanded their partnership, new clients came on board, and for the first time in my career, I no longer felt the need to prove my value to people who had already decided who deserved credit. What mattered wasn't the promotion, the office, or even the title. What mattered was learning that silence and weakness are not the same thing. For a long time, people assumed I stayed quiet because I lacked confidence. The truth was much simpler. I stayed quiet because facts age better than opinions. Eventually, every shortcut, every false narrative, and every undeserved advantage runs into reality. And when it does, the people who spent their energy building appearances often discover they neglected the one thing that actually matters: substance. Looking back, I still remember that meeting where my boss called me replaceable. I remember the laughter. I remember writing down one name. Most of all, I remember realizing that not every battle needs to be fought immediately. Some victories arrive when you stop arguing and start paying attention. If you've ever been underestimated, overlooked, or watched someone else take credit for your work, let me know in the comments. And if you enjoy stories where patience beats arrogance, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more workplace karma stories.